By early 1915, Russia stood on the Eastern Front with one of the largest armies the world had ever seen. Millions of men were in uniform, stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Carpathian Mountains. On paper, this force looked unstoppable. In reality, it was quietly running out of everything that modern war required. Many Russian soldiers went into battle without rifles, ordered to wait until a fallen comrade dropped one. Artillery units rationed shells so strictly that some guns could fire only once or twice a day. Officers and experienced non-commissioned leaders had been lost faster than they could be trained or replaced. Even basic supplies, boots, food, medical equipment were in short supply. The Russian army had manpower, but it lacked the industrial backbone to sustain a long, mechanized war. Across the front lines, Germany was learning how to fight a new kind of conflict, one powered by factories, railways, and heavy artillery. While Russian troops relied on endurance and courage, their opponents relied on coordination, precision, and overwhelming firepower. This imbalance would soon have devastating consequences. The battlefield was no longer decided by numbers alone, but by logistics, planning, and the ability to turn steel and explosives into decisive force. As the spring of 1915 approached, Russian commanders sensed danger but struggled to respond. Warning signs were everywhere. Empty depots, exhausted units, and a system stretched beyond its limits. What followed would become one of the greatest military retreats in modern history, a withdrawal that reshaped the war, shattered entire regions, and pushed an empire toward crisis. If you are interested in powerful historical stories that reveal how wars are truly won and lost, do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more in-depth, carefully researched history to life. While the Russian army struggled to hold its vast front together, events on the other side of the lines were moving with ruthless clarity. In Berlin and Vienna, the winter of 1914-1915 had exposed a dangerous truth. Austria-Hungary was close to collapse. Its armies had bled heavily in Galicia and the Carpathians. Its officer corps was shattered, and its ability to sustain another failed campaign was in doubt. If Austria-Hungary fell, Germany would stand alone against a coalition that was growing stronger by the month. For German leaders, the Eastern Front was no longer a secondary theater, it was a problem that demanded immediate action. The solution took shape not as a gamble, but as a calculated decision rooted in experience. German commanders had learned that modern warfare rewarded concentration, preparation, and timing, rather than spreading forces thin across hundreds of kilometers. They would strike at a chosen point with overwhelming strength. Railways began carrying divisions eastward, artillery was repositioned, and supply depots filled with shells in numbers the Russian side could scarcely imagine. The goal was not to destroy Russia in a single blow, but to break its fighting power, force a retreat, and give Austria-Hungary the breathing space it desperately needed. As spring turned to early summer, the contrast between the two armies grew sharper. Russian soldiers dug in behind fragile defenses, relying on courage and endurance to compensate for empty magazines and silent guns. Across from them, German and Austro-Hungarian batteries waited in carefully surveyed positions, their crews trained to fire with precision and speed. Infantry units rehearsed their movements, not for heroic charges, but for disciplined advances timed to the minute. The battlefield was being prepared like a machine, each part designed to support the next. When the offensive finally began, it did not announce itself with days of thunderous bombardment, but with a short, crushing storm of fire. Russian positions were struck with an intensity they could not answer. Communication lines were severed, and command structures began to unravel. Behind the shells came the infantry, advancing in coordinated waves, moving into ground already shaken and disorganized. What they encountered was not cowardice, but confusion and exhaustion, the inevitable result of an army pushed beyond its limits. News of the breakthrough spread quickly along the front. Units that had held their ground for months suddenly found their flanks exposed. Their neighbors gone, and their orders overtaken by events. Attempts to stabilize the line faltered, not because of a lack of will, but because there were too few reserves and too little firepower to stop what had been set in motion. The offensive gained momentum, feeding on its own success, forcing Russian commanders into a series of desperate choices. For Austria-Hungary, the advance was a lifeline. German strength carried its exhausted ally forward, lifting the immediate threat from the Carpathians and reversing months of humiliation. For Germany, it was proof that control of industry, logistics, and planning could turn the course of a war even against a numerically superior enemy. And for Russia, it marked the moment when strain became rupture, when shortages and miscalculations converged into a retreat that would reshape the Eastern Front and echo far beyond the battlefield. What began as a strategic decision in distant capitals now unfolded as a human drama on an enormous scale, one that would pull soldiers and civilians alike into a moving tide of defeat, survival, and uncertainty. All of the pressures that had been building through the winter and early spring converged in one place in early May 1915. Along a quiet stretch of the Eastern Front between the towns of Gorlice and Tarnow. On the map, it appeared unremarkable, just another sector of trenches winding through fields and low hills. Yet beneath its surface lay the fault line of the Russian war effort. Here, shortages were acute, defensive lines were thin, and reserves were scarce. When the Central Powers chose this sector, they did so not by chance, but because it offered the clearest opportunity to turn imbalance into collapse. In the early hours of the attack, the landscape itself seemed to recoil. Artillery fire fell with a density and accuracy Russian troops had rarely experienced. Trenches disappeared, wire was torn apart, and communication lines were cut almost instantly. The bombardment was brief, but it was precisely timed and devastating in effect. Designed not to terrorize, but to paralyze, Russian gunners attempted to respond, only to discover that their fire was sporadic and ineffective, their limited supply of shells forcing silence at the moment it mattered most. When the infantry advanced, they moved into a battlefield already stripped of coherence. Units that had prepared to resist found themselves isolated, their commanders unable to see, hear, or communicate with neighboring formations. The defensive system, fragile even before the assault, began to fracture under pressure. Soldiers fought where they stood, but without artillery support or clear orders, resistance became local rather than coordinated. What followed was not a dramatic collapse in a single moment, but a rapid unraveling that spread along the line. As news of the breakthrough reached Russian headquarters, disbelief gave way to alarm. The speed of the advance shattered assumptions that time still existed to reorganize and reinforce. Attempts were made to plug the gap, but reserves were few and arrived piecemeal, thrown into a situation already beyond control. Each effort to stabilize the front only revealed how deep the rupture had become. Positions meant to serve as fallback lines proved weaker than the first, offering little more than temporary delay. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Entire formations found their flanks exposed, supply routes threatened, and retreat as the only option left. As units pulled back, they did so under constant pressure, with little opportunity to regroup. Roads filled with exhausted soldiers, wounded men, and abandoned equipment, all moving eastward in a growing tide. The retreat fed on itself, not because discipline vanished overnight, but because the battlefield no longer offered firm ground on which to stand. For the Central Powers, Gorlice-Tarnow confirmed the effectiveness of their approach. Concentrated firepower and careful coordination had achieved in days what months of fighting had not. The breakthrough opened the way into Galicia and forced the Russians to abandon hard-won positions. Reversing the gains of the previous year, momentum shifted decisively, and with it the psychological balance of the campaign. For the Russian army, the offensive marked a turning point from which there was no easy recovery. The retreat that began at Gorlice would expand into a vast movement across entire provinces, drawing civilians into its wake and placing unbearable strain on an already fragile system. What had started as a localized defeat now revealed itself as the opening chapter of a much larger disaster, one that would redefine the war in the East and expose the limits of an empire fighting beyond its means. As the retreat widened after Gorlice, Russian soldiers began to recognize a grim pattern in the way the enemy advanced. It was not chaotic, nor was it driven by sudden bursts of aggression. Instead, it moved with an almost mechanical certainty, a methodical process that repeated itself again and again along the front. This approach soon earned a name among those who faced it: the Mackensen steamroller, a system of warfare that combined preparation, coordination, and relentless pressure into a single, crushing force. The process always began beyond the reach of Russian guns. Heavy artillery was positioned carefully, often miles behind the front lines, where it could fire without fear of effective retaliation. Observers in the air directed the fire with growing precision, turning the sky into an extension of the battlefield. From above, trench lines, supply routes, and strongpoints were identified and marked, and the guns adjusted their aim accordingly. Russian defenses, already weakened by shortages and fatigue, were struck repeatedly until their structure collapsed under the weight of shells they could not answer. Once the bombardment achieved its purpose, the infantry moved forward, not in reckless charges, but in controlled advances that followed closely behind the falling shells. By the time Russian soldiers realized the fire had lifted, enemy troops were already at the edge of their positions. The defenders were forced into close combat without the support they needed. While communications with higher command were often severed, resistance continued in pockets, but the wider defensive line had already been compromised. What made the steamroller especially effective was not just its power, but its repetition. After seizing a position, the artillery was moved forward, the observers adjusted their vantage points, and the cycle began again. Each step forward weakened the Russian army further, reducing its ability to regroup or establish a stable line. Positions meant to slow the advance lasted hours or days at best, never long enough to change the overall direction of the campaign. For Russian commanders, the situation was deeply frustrating. Reports from the front spoke of courage and endurance, but also of guns without shells, units without clear orders, and men fighting with dwindling confidence. Attempts to counterattack rarely had the necessary coordination or firepower to succeed. Even when infantry held their ground, they were eventually forced to withdraw as neighboring units were pushed back, exposing their flanks and threatening encirclement. The psychological impact of the steamroller was as damaging as its physical effects. Soldiers began to believe that no position was truly defensible, that every stand was temporary, and that retreat was only a matter of time. This erosion of confidence spread through the ranks, weakening discipline and undermining morale, even among units that had not yet faced the full force of the enemy advance. The sense of inevitability became a weapon in itself. Yet the advancing armies were not immune to strain. The men operating the guns and marching forward paid a heavy price in exhaustion and losses. The advance demanded constant movement, long marches over poor roads, and unbroken attention to logistics and coordination. Still, as long as the system functioned, it maintained its momentum, pressing the Russians farther back with each carefully measured push. In this way, the Mackensen steamroller transformed the retreat from a reaction into a condition of the war itself. It was not a single tactic, but a demonstration of how modern warfare rewarded preparation and punished weakness. For Russia, it exposed the consequences of fighting an industrial war without an industrial foundation. For the Eastern Front as a whole, it marked a shift toward a form of conflict where method and material mattered as much as bravery, shaping the course of the campaign with relentless, grinding force. As the pressure of the advancing armies continued to mount, The retreat ceased to be a temporary response and became a broad transformation of the Eastern Front. Territories that Russia had seized at great cost the year before now slipped away with alarming speed. Galicia, once a symbol of Russian momentum, turned into a corridor of withdrawal. Its towns and countryside repeatedly contested and then abandoned, roads filled with troops moving eastward as the front line shifted not by kilometers, but by entire regions. One of the most powerful symbols of this reversal was Przemyśl. The fortress had been captured earlier by Russian forces after a long and costly struggle, celebrated as proof of endurance and sacrifice. Now, it stood directly in the path of the advancing Central Powers. Modern heavy artillery was brought forward and methodically applied, reducing defenses that had once seemed formidable. The fall of Przemyśl was more than a military event. It was a psychological blow. What had been won with blood was lost with unsettling speed, reinforcing the sense that the balance of the war had tilted decisively. From Galicia, the advance pressed northward toward the heart of Russian Poland. Here, the landscape was dominated by a network of fortresses built to protect key cities and river crossings. Many of these structures dated from an earlier era, designed to resist the guns of the 19th century rather than the massive, high-caliber artillery now arrayed against them. As the Central Powers approached, these forts were subjected to concentrated bombardments that exposed their obsolescence. Walls cracked, emplacements were buried, and garrisons found themselves trapped inside defenses that no longer offered true protection. The collapse of these fortifications unfolded with startling speed. Some garrisons attempted to resist, clinging to the belief that their positions could still hold, while others surrendered once it became clear that relief would not come. With each fortress that fell, the path forward widened. Supplies, guns, and prisoners passed into enemy hands, further strengthening the momentum of the advance. What had once been a shield for Russian Poland now became a liability, consuming resources without delivering security. The fall of Warsaw marked the culmination of this phase of the retreat. For generations, the city had stood as a political and symbolic center of Russian authority in the region. As enemy forces closed in, the decision to abandon it was heavy with consequence. The withdrawal was carried out under immense strain, with troops destroying what they could not take and civilians fleeing alongside the army. When opposing troops entered the city, it signaled not just another territorial loss, but a profound erosion of prestige and confidence. The loss of Galicia, Przemyśl, and Warsaw reshaped the war in the east. The front line moved hundreds of kilometers, and millions of people suddenly found themselves displaced. Occupied, or on the road, for Russian soldiers, each new retreat reinforced the feeling that solid ground was becoming harder to find. For the advancing armies, success brought both opportunity and burden, as extended supply lines and exhausted troops tested the limits of their system. Yet above all, these victories demonstrated a stark reality of modern warfare. Fortresses, traditions, and past successes offered little protection against an enemy that combined mobility, firepower, and coordination. The collapse of these key positions was not merely a series of defeats, but a confirmation that the war had entered a phase where adaptation determined survival. As the front continued to shift eastward, the consequences of that lesson would echo far beyond the ruins of cities and forts, shaping the next chapters of the conflict. As the armies moved eastward and the front lines dissolved into motion, the war spilled fully into the lives of civilians. What had once been distant thunder now arrived at village gates and city streets, turning entire regions into corridors of flight. The retreat was no longer measured only in lost territory or broken units, but in human movement on a scale that few in Europe had ever witnessed. Families left their homes with whatever they could carry, unsure whether they were fleeing danger or simply following the army into uncertainty. Russian authorities, fearing that supplies might fall into enemy hands, ordered wide-ranging evacuations and destruction. Railways were dismantled, warehouses emptied or burned, and crops removed or destroyed. For those caught in the path of these measures, the logic of military necessity offered little comfort. Fields that had sustained families for generations were left barren, and towns that had survived earlier campaigns were stripped of the resources needed to endure the coming months. The retreat reshaped the landscape as surely as artillery fire had done. The flow of refugees grew by the day. Long lines of carts stretched across muddy roads, mixed with soldiers, wounded men, and animals driven eastward. Children walked beside exhausted parents, and the elderly lagged behind, their pace set by fatigue rather than fear. Illness spread easily in these moving crowds, and burial along the roadside became a grim reality. Local authorities, already overwhelmed, struggled to provide shelter or food, while central institutions proved unable to manage a crisis of such magnitude. At the same time, policies of deportation deepened the suffering. Entire communities were uprooted based on suspicion or strategic concern, their loyalty questioned simply because of language, religion, or proximity to the front. Families were separated, livelihoods erased, and trust between civilians and the state eroded. What had begun as a military retreat increasingly resembled a social rupture, one that left lasting scars across the western provinces of the empire. Life under occupation brought its own hardships. Civilians in newly controlled areas faced requisitions and forced labor, often compelled to clear battlefields, rebuild roads, or work the land under supervision. Men and women alike were drawn into these labor systems, their daily existence shaped by the demands of a war they could not influence. The boundaries between soldier and civilian blurred, as survival itself became a form of endurance. The psychological impact of this humanitarian disaster was profound. For those fleeing east, the retreat symbolized abandonment, a sense that the state could no longer protect its people. For those left behind, occupation created an atmosphere of uncertainty and adaptation, where routines were rewritten by necessity. Across the empire, stories of suffering traveled faster than official reports, feeding anxiety, anger, and disillusionment. This human dimension of the retreat revealed a deeper truth about the conflict. The war was no longer confined to trenches and headquarters. It had become a force reshaping societies from the inside out. The movement of millions strained the economy, disrupted agriculture, and undermined confidence in institutions already under pressure. Long before political collapse became visible, the humanitarian catastrophe of 1915 had begun to loosen the bonds between state and society. In this way, the retreat did more than redraw maps. It transformed the war into a lived experience of loss and displacement for ordinary people, embedding the consequences of military defeat into daily life. The echoes of this upheaval would persist long after the armies halted, influencing how the war was remembered and how the future would unfold. Amid the long columns of retreat and the steady loss of ground, moments of fierce resistance still flickered across the collapsing front. In certain places, units refused to yield easily, holding their positions with a determination that defied the broader tide of events. These episodes did not reverse the retreat, but they revealed the complexity of what was unfolding. The Russian army was not simply dissolving, it was straining against forces that overwhelmed its structure, even as individual soldiers and formations continued to fight with resolve. One of the most striking examples emerged at the fortress of Osowiec. Isolated and heavily pressured, its garrison endured bombardment and conditions that tested physical and mental endurance. When attacked with new and terrifying methods of warfare, the defenders did not vanish into panic. Instead, they counterattacked, driving back their opponents and briefly reclaiming lost ground. News of the defense spread quickly, magnified by rumor and retelling, transforming the episode into a symbol of courage under extreme circumstances. For a moment, It suggested that resistance was still possible, that the retreat was not absolute. Yet such moments stood out precisely because they were exceptions. Beyond these isolated stands, the larger system that held the army together was fraying. Command structures struggled to function as units were shifted, withdrawn, and reassembled under constant pressure. Orders arrived late or conflicted with realities on the ground, and officers often found themselves commanding formations that bore little resemblance to those they had trained. The distance between headquarters decisions and frontline conditions widened with every kilometer of retreat. Morale suffered not from a single shock, but from accumulation. Soldiers who had marched and fought for months without relief began to doubt whether any position could be held for long. Each withdrawal reinforced the belief that sacrifice merely postponed the inevitable. Even disciplined units felt the weight of uncertainty, as neighboring formations disappeared and familiar landmarks vanished behind them. Courage remained, but confidence eroded, and without confidence, cohesion became harder to sustain. Leadership faced its own crisis. Experienced officers had been lost earlier in the war, and replacements were often young, overburdened, and thrust into responsibility without preparation. Many tried to impose order amid chaos, but the tools at their disposal were limited. Shortages of communication equipment, transportation, and artillery support meant that even sound decisions could not always be executed. The gap between intent and outcome widened, breeding frustration on all sides. As the retreat continued, discipline became uneven. Most soldiers followed orders and endured hardship, yet signs of strain appeared more frequently. Units arrived at new positions exhausted, only to be ordered onward before they could rest or reorganize. The sense of fighting a defensive war gave way to the feeling of being pushed along by events beyond anyone's control. In this atmosphere, cohesion weakened not through sudden collapse, but through gradual erosion. The contrast between heroic resistance and systemic failure revealed a deeper truth. The Russian army still possessed bravery and loyalty at the individual level, but modern war demanded more than personal valor. It required stable command, reliable supply, and confidence that sacrifice served a clear purpose. As these elements slipped away, isolated acts of resistance could inspire, but they could not restore what had been lost. By late summer, the retreat had become a test not just of endurance, but of belief. Soldiers continued to fight, yet increasingly questioned the direction and meaning of the struggle. The defense of places like Osowiec lingered in memory as proof of what was possible, even as the broader reality pointed elsewhere. In this tension between courage and collapse, the Russian army carried forward, holding together just long enough to survive, but no longer strong enough to decide its own fate. By the time the Great Retreat of 1915 finally slowed and the front lines stabilized, the scale of what Russia had lost was impossible to ignore. Vast stretches of territory were gone, including some of the empire's most populated and economically important regions. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured, and millions of civilians had been displaced from their homes. On the surface, the army still stood, and the war continued, but beneath that appearance of endurance lay a nation profoundly shaken. The retreat did more than weaken Russia's military position. It exposed the fragility of the political system that directed the war. Failures at the front echoed loudly at home, where shortages, rising prices, and public frustration fed a growing sense of disillusionment. Confidence in leadership eroded as defeats mounted and explanations rang hollow. Decisions made under pressure intended to restore control often had the opposite effect, tying the fate of the state ever more closely to the outcome of a war it was struggling to manage. Within the army, the consequences were just as deep. Soldiers had not lost their willingness to fight, but many had lost faith in the competence of those above them. The gap between sacrifice and reward felt wider with every retreat, and discipline increasingly depended on endurance rather than belief. The shared experience of loss and hardship bound men together, yet it also sharpened awareness of inequality, mismanagement, and the human cost of distant decisions. These strains did not produce immediate collapse, but they planted seeds of instability that would grow over the next 2 years. Political opposition became more organized, criticism more open, and rumors more powerful. The war had mobilized society on an unprecedented scale, and in doing so, it had awakened expectations that the old system could not satisfy. By surviving the retreat, Russia had postponed defeat on the battlefield, but it had also drawn closer to a reckoning at home. In hindsight, the Great Retreat stands as a turning point not because it ended the war, but because it changed Russia's relationship with it. The events of 1915 revealed that victory required more than courage and numbers. It demanded trust between state and society, between leaders and soldiers. When that trust fractured, the consequences reached far beyond the front lines, shaping the revolutionary storms that would soon follow. Thank you for watching and for staying with this story until the end. If you found this exploration of history meaningful and want to see more in-depth narratives like this, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue sharing powerful stories from the past and understanding how they still shape our world today.